While I often talk about the TurboGrafx as the king of shmups, and I still maintain that it probably is, that doesn't mean there aren't plenty of unique and fantastic 2D shoot-'em-ups to be found on other platforms. And nipping at the heels of the Turbo in that respect is the Sega Genesis. That said, if you're watching this video, you probably already know about the Truxtons and the Thunder Forces and the Mushas of the Genesis, right? So, as usual, I'm going to try to dive into some lesser-known waters here and talk about some Genesis shmups that are underrated, at least in my view, and see if maybe they deserve a little bit more credit than they tend to get. Spoiler alert, they do. Technosoft is much more widely known by shmup fans as the folks that made 4 excellent Thunder Force games, and Thunder Force 5, but somewhere between Thunder Forces they also churned out what I consider to be a hidden gem for the Genesis in Elemental Master. Here they did away with all the spacefaring futuristic settings that are so common in these games for a more mystical, dark fantasy vibe. Here you'll see black magic and mythological beasts coming at you from all sides, while the vertically scrolling levels push you forward. Layden here has taken on the mission of defeating an evil sorcerer and saving the land from his army of monsters, and the only way to do that is to master the elements, I guess. Each completed stage nets Layden a new weapon that can be selected at any time, Gradius style. After beating the first 4 stages in whatever order you want, it's on to the second half of the game where 3 more stages with much higher difficulty unfold in a more linear fashion, and where each and every one of your weapons will be needed at some point. While those first 4 levels are rather approachable, Elemental Master spikes its difficulty dramatically in this second half, so you'll get both sides of the coin here. I rather like how this game handles its challenge. It gives you a good while to get your bearings, but it also knows how to turn up the heat. Elemental Master is a pretty good-looking game to me. I'd put it up there with Thunder Force 2 or 3 in terms of the bold, colorful levels and interesting enemy designs. Now, there might not be as much in the way of scrolling layers and other visual spectacles as those Thunder Force games have, but there's still more than enough color and diversity here to keep every level interesting and fun. And it also helps that there's a ton of different enemy types that rarely repeat, and almost, if not every level, seems to have unique environmental hazards to keep track of too. All of that somehow with the levels not going on too long, which gives the game a nice brisk pace. Enemies often come up from behind, but you have a dedicated button to firing behind you in Elemental Master, which is a nice touch. Though with no indicator letting you know that enemies are coming in from the bottom, you'll generally want to avoid hanging back in favor of being somewhere in the middle a lot of the time, which creates a special kind of tension that I'm not sure if it was intended or not, but I kinda like it, even though it's maybe a little bit exhausting for my eyes to be darting around the screen constantly looking for the next enemy. The firing here is kind of unique for the genre, as it's sort of a balance between full-on rapid fire and the more standard one press for one bullet style that you'll find in some shooters. It's basically like a burst fire, where each press gives you a handful of shots, so you're not going to be wearing out your thumb like you would in, say, Truxton, but you're not resting on your laurels with full-on turbo fire either. And I like it. It's a good balance. You can also hold down the fire button to charge a special attack at any time, which is different for each weapon, though some of them are more useful than others, as they can clear the entire screen or do much wimpier, more useless things. Overall, the weapon variety here is on point, and I like the versatility they all introduce. I find the spread shot from the waves to be a good choice for a lot of the game, especially in the first few levels, but more specialty weapons, like the fireballs and the horizontal pinwheels, definitely give you an edge in certain situations. So it's definitely a good idea to be familiar with and ready to switch to every weapon at any time. A little icing on the cake here is Elemental Master's above-average soundtrack. It doesn't quite reach the highs of Thunder Force music in my opinion, but it gets pretty close. It kinda reminds me of the music in Devilish actually, which is fitting I guess, since they both have sort of a dark fantasy theme. In any case, this is beyond a good shmup for the Genesis that I think remains underrated and overlooked for reasons that I don't really understand. I guess it probably comes down to the sci-fi aesthetics being missing, and the cover art and the title never really doing a good job of communicating that this is indeed a shmup and not some sort of RPG or something. But I highly suggest trying it out. The smooth on-ramp for the difficulty and the excellent level of weapon and enemy variety make it a must-play for any fan of the genre. Insector X is an addictive horizontal scrolling shmup that brings an insect theme to the genre, making it one of very few games to actually try that, which is sort of surprising. You'd think there'd be a lot more of them, no, but there's not. Despite being a one-hit kill game, most of Insector X is actually pretty easy, and that, combined with the insect theme, makes it stand out pretty well. And it's kind of a nice companion game for Cybercore from the Grafx, though it's not quite as good as that one. Insector X has a bright and colorful feel to it that sometimes gives way to more dark and menacing spots, and this makes each level feel distinct, though the near-complete lack of layering or animation in the backgrounds also makes the levels feel a bit flat. Not a deal-breaker for me, of course, but I can see why that would result in this game being more easily dismissed in favor of the plethora of flashier and more impressive-looking Genesis games. The difficulty also stays a little bit too easy for a little bit too long in my view. The one-hit kills are an ever-present threat, sure, but as long as you're halfway decent at these games, holding on to your upgrades and keeping enemies pushed back to the edge of the screen isn't very difficult for the majority of the first few levels. The bosses also don't do a whole lot to keep you on your toes. That aside, the difficulty does pick up about halfway through, and the levels only get more interesting as it goes along, so it does eventually blossom into a much better game than it initially seems like it is. The weapons are pretty straightforward, with a main shot with a linear upgrade path, and a few alternate shots that can be upgraded and switched around. The bomb drop gets increasingly important as more ground enemies are introduced, and you'll occasionally find these lightning bolts that damage everything on the screen, though it's not entirely apparent that's what it does. Insector X's music fares pretty well, with a solid set of tracks throughout that complement their levels well. Nothing here is gonna knock your socks off, but it does use the Genesis sound chip nicely in my view, with nothing being too bassy or tinny like some Genesis games could be. The music has a great grasp of the tone of the game without overshadowing the sound effects or visuals. It just kind of fits right in there with everything else at a relatively equal level of importance. Good audio management all around here. So while Insector X certainly has its flaws and misses a couple of big opportunities to be more impressive, I still think there's plenty of fun factor here, and fans of the genre should really give it a chance to win them over. I would recommend it to beginners even more so, as those easier first few levels can be a great introduction to the genre, and the large roster of cool insect-themed enemies is a nice plus. Its greatest flaw is that it backloads too many of its better levels in the second half of the game, making it come off more bland than it actually is. And I bet you a lot of people that played this back in the day didn't stick with it long enough to see any of that. That said, I guess it's fair to say this is more of a mid-tier shooter at the end of the day, but if you give yourself some time to acquire a taste for it, I think you'll walk away from it as a bigger fan than you were. Vapor Trail from Data East probably isn't underrated as much as it's just kind of overlooked and forgotten. Those that have played it seem to really like it, but at the same time, I just don't feel like enough people really have actually played it. Released right around the same time as Override on the PC Engine, Data East continues to flex its shooter muscles here too. Extremely tight controls, fun weapons, highly detailed environments, great music. Vapor Trail really kinda has it all. At first glance, it looks pretty standard, with a lot of environments and enemy types that you've seen before and since. But kinda like Override, Vapor Trail is more about execution than innovation. And Vapor Trail leans into that execution, as well as some pretty stiff challenge, throwing you into the meat grinder pretty much from the outset. So if you've grown accustomed to the incremental difficulty of Elemental Master and Insector X, Vapor Trail's gonna feel like a bucket of ice water. Here you can select from 3 different ships, each with slightly different firing styles and drastically different default speeds. Now you can upgrade every ship's speed with the corresponding pickups, but I'd recommend going with the fastest one and just dealing with the comparatively weaker fire. Low damage output isn't a death sentence like slow speed can be in a game like this, especially in its later levels. Levels throughout the game can blur together a little bit at times, although they do change around just enough and feature some cool scrolling layers that the game easily maintains a sense of high quality. The weapons are all solid choices, albeit a little bit derivative, even for the time. The ringfire is probably the most unique, but doesn't feel particularly useful during boss fights, nor does it really fit the tone of the rest of the game. I'm partial to the bombs personally, but the heat-seeking missiles are nothing to sneeze at either. All of them are effective when fully upgraded though, but of course you lose everything whenever you die. Thankfully, Vapor Trail gives you 3 hit points and very occasionally lets you replenish one of them. But don't take those 3 hit points for granted. They do not mean you'll be coasting through any portion of the game. The challenge here is above average, with long levels and complex bosses, so no matter how you slice it, you'll need to get good to see much of it at all. Now, one thing that does set Vapor Trail apart from the herd, at least a little bit, is the special super weapon that combines with your ship and turns it into a much more formidable machine until you either die or detonate it. Doing the latter will deal tons of damage to nearby enemies, and put you back on whatever regular weapon you have equipped. The roll ability is also something to take advantage of, as it renders you invincible for a short time. And while it does take a while to charge back up, it's technically unlimited, so use it whenever you can. Not forgetting to use this can often make the difference between surviving hectic moments and not, so I can't overstate the importance of it. So between the special weapon and the roll ability, Vapor Trail is able to carve out its own identity a little bit, but you have to play it for a while to really get the hang of these things and appreciate that. Which I suspect is at least part of why the game isn't really mentioned much these days. Also, that painfully generic cover art definitely wasn't doing it any favors. The music in Vapor Trail is epic, and suitably energetic, which is what I've come to expect from Data East games. There is a small number of tunes, but each one packs a punch, and I think they really elevate the game well. Though the music does seem to be in mono, which is a little disappointing. Data East put tons of stereo separation in other games around this time, so I'm not sure what happened to that here. Ah well, it's still a really good soundtrack. The sound effects don't fare quite as well in my opinion, but they get the job done with some punchy explosions and a few voice samples, which wasn't super common back in '91, so some extra points for that. Overall, I think Vapor Trail gets basically everything right, but also just got lost in the shuffle with the avalanche of shooters hitting the Genesis at the same time, which squeezed a lot of otherwise good games like this out of the limelight and into the bargain bins. I highly recommend it though, especially if you feel like you're ready for a stiffer challenge than the average shooter provides. Also, it supports co-op, which is always a plus. Wings of War, or as you might know it, Gynoog, depending on your region, is a shoot-'em-up that languished in my backlog for about 20 years or so, but once I eventually gave it the time of day, it quickly became one of my favorite shmups in the entire Genesis library. Here we see sort of an angels versus demons theme, but it quickly devolves into almost Choaniki levels of nonsense, which to me is a very good thing because that keeps the game extremely unpredictable. You'll end up in sunken pirate ship wreckage, random castles, what appears to be some sort of digestive system, and all kinds of other places. The increasingly bizarre enemies are just as random. You got your flying heads, sentient clouds that cry hamburger meat, and some rather disturbing bosses that seem to have crawled right out of H.R. Geiger's nightmares. These bosses in particular are probably my favorite part of the game. These fights don't always last as long as I would like, but I'd still say that they're the high point of the game. The weaponry here isn't as interesting as everything else, unfortunately. I like what's here, but there just isn't very much variety. You got a few different firing types, which have slight emphasis on spread or power, but for the most part, they're all really similar and barely change the way the game plays at all. A handful of temporary magic abilities mix things up to some extent, but not as much as I'd like. This doesn't drag the game down as much as it just kind of feels like a squandered opportunity to elevate it further. Now, one thing that does legitimately bug me about this game is the lack of a manual speed control. Now, I don't feel like this is needed in every shmup, since many of them are designed around starting you off slow and giving you time to clamor for more speed pickups. That's fine, but here the base speed is already moderately fast, so going very far beyond that actually makes you too fast, especially when you need to be precise and crisscross around enemy fire and the large amounts of enemies that often spill onto the whole screen. The only real way to slow down, as far as I can tell, is to lose a life, which kinda sucks. And this is why I'm such a huge proponent of manual speed controls in games like this, but oh well. Still, I find Wings of War to be an extremely entertaining ride through 16-bit absurdity, and I always enjoy my time with it. It's got substance to back up its style, with wildly different enemies and well-designed environments that contrast well with foreground objects. The suitably strange soundtrack and handful of neat visual effects here and there push the game over the edge into outstanding territory for me. It leverages the capabilities of the Genesis well, with only a couple of sections suffering from any noticeable slowdown. And what it seems to lack in weapon variety and general balance is more than made up for with that strange and striking sort of charm that just feels emblematic of the Sega Genesis. So while there's a ton of other great underrated shmups for the Genesis that could absolutely be mentioned in this video, I think that's a good little introduction to what can be found if you're willing to do a little bit of digging underneath the mainstream. It's hard to pick a favorite out of these, but I guess if I had to, I'd say Elemental Master by just a tiny little bit. I think I just have a soft spot for games that bring aesthetics and themes over to genres that don't normally have them. But let me know which one is your favorite, and also let me know some other underrated shmups, and maybe I'll talk about them in a follow-up. I'm sure there's at least a couple dozen that could absolutely qualify, but until then, as always, thanks for watching.